On December 27, 2010, fishing vessel the Lurongyu 2682 set sail from the port of Shidao in the Shandong city Rongcheng. The 23-man crew were destined for the fishing grounds located off the coast of Chile and Peru in the South Pacific Ocean, to spend the next 2 years squid jigging. After being cleared and leaving the port, a small boat approached the vessel, and a further 10 men boarded the ship, taking the crew numbers up to 33. Only 7 months later, on July 29, 2011, 1,000 nautical miles off the coast of Japan, the ship was approached by the Japanese Coast Guard. A distress call from the vessel had been received by the Fisheries Authority in China, who asked their Japanese counterparts to investigate. On boarding the vessel, the Japanese Coast Guard immediately recognized something was very wrong, believing the crew numbers were far too small for their reason for being at sea. Of the 33-man crew that set sail from Shandong, only 11 remained. There were bad omens for the journey before the ship even left port. Most of the crew had gathered on the vessel in the November of 2010 and were stocking up the boat for the time away at sea. One night, the crew already gathered on the ship were playing cards and drinking, when the ship's cook Yanwei began screaming and shouting, pacing back and forth on the deck, a knife in hand, saying he was going to end someone's life. His ranting continued for 2 hours, until the ship's captain Li Tengquan rebuked him, which seemingly calmed the chef. He rejoined and sat with the crew for a time before getting up and silently leaving the table. Initially believing he just went to the toilet, the other members of the crew thought little about it, but on hearing something splashing into the sea, they rushed on deck. Yanwei had jumped into the cold winter water. It took the crew over 30 minutes in the dark to find him clutching onto the anchor line and fish him out of the water. Yanwei was an experienced seafarer who'd sailed several fishing expeditions in the past with the captain Li Tengquan, but his mother recently passed away. The stress of this combined with the thought of being away from home for the next 2 years seemingly caused the chef to break down mentally. Yanwei was sent home after the incident, but returned a few days later saying his head was clear and he wanted to rejoin the crew. However, the captain had seen enough and already found a replacement, Xia Qiyong. The crew were looking at getting paid 95,000 yuan, 11,500 USD, plus bonuses for the 2 years at sea. Li Tengquan didn't want to risk taking Yanwei if he was experiencing issues before they even set sail. The senior crew members were all experienced sailors. Captain Li Tengquan was 40 years old and from the Liaoning northeastern province city Dadian. He was a large imposing figure who managed his ship with an iron fist, treating his crew to furious rents and beatings for lacking discipline or making mistakes. Other senior crew members were also natives of Liaoning province, hailing from various cities around the region. Several of the licensed deckhands were relatives of the senior crew and largely resided in the city of Dadian. The remainder of the crew already on board came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were farmers, some construction workers, and some former convicts. One of the former convicts frequently boasted that he'd been sent to a hard labor camp for ending the lives of 2 people, although it later emerged he'd only been convicted of robbery. One of the younger members of the crew was even a recent college graduate, attracted to the work by the high salary on offer. These men came from various northern provinces including Heilongjiang, Jilin, Shandong, and 6 of the crew were native to Inner Mongolia. Many of the men didn't have seafaring licenses, meaning the company was employing them illegally. Getting a seafaring license cost the company 7,000 yuan per person, around 845 USD, so companies tried to cut costs by allowing unlicensed workers onto the vessels. The 23 men on the boat all had licenses, but after being checked by customs and leaving the port, 10 men without seafaring licenses boarded the ship from another boat while at sea. Among the group was the man who'd eventually lead a mutiny which would result in the homicides of 16 people and see a further 6 jump into the ocean, Liu Guiduo. 27 years old at the time and one of the Heilongjiang contingent of the crew, he hailed from Longjiang County. He mostly worked as a farmer around his hometown area and was believed to have spent some time in the military. He was also said to have some experience on fishing boats, albeit only those that fished close to the Chinese coast. a crew member who later gave interviews about the events that transpired on the boat under the pseudonym Zhao Mucheng, but is believed to be one of the younger crewmates Duan Zhifang, shared a cabin with Liu Guiduo. He described Liu Guiduo as being much smarter than his level of education suggested, and while being friendly and a good communicator, also wouldn't waste time talking to people he didn't like. Duan Zhifang also spoke about an unusual habit of Liu Guiduo, discovering it after he looked over a notebook the man left open in the cabin. The book contained notes on the daily movements of the various crew members, and who they mostly socialized with, along with lines of numbers Duan Zhifang didn't understand. Curious, Duan Zhifang asked Liu Guiduo what the numbers were, and was told they were a daily record of the ship's positional coordinates. The answer only led to Duan Zhifang having more questions, and he asked Liu Guiduo why he was doing this. Liu Guiduo responded by claiming it was just something to keep his mind occupied while the ship headed to the fishing grounds. The entire crew had been introduced to each other prior to setting sail, and Liu Guiduo invited several of the men to dinner, for which he picked up the bill. When boarding the ship, he brought 165 cartons of cigarettes, which despite him being a heavy smoker, he was happy to share with his crewmates. His friendliness and apparent generosity quickly made him a popular figure among the crew. The trip to the waters off the coast of Chile and Peru started smoothly. The crew spent much of the journey gambling while playing mahjong, cards, or dominoes. The gambling allowed Liu Guiduo to again display his apparently generous character, seemingly being happy to help people out with loans when they lost money, giving them a chance to win some back. As the crew got to know each other, they quickly split into 4 distinct factions. The largest group was the 15-man Yaoning faction, with the ship's captain Li Chengquan being the leading figure, and the other men largely hailing from Dalian City. All of the senior crew members were part of this group, and several other members were their relatives. It included the first officer Fu Yizhong, second officer Wang Yongbo, the new chef Xia Qiyong, and chief engineer Wen Dou. The replacement cook Xia Qiyong was actually from Heilongjiang, but quickly aligned himself with the Liaoning men. The next largest group was the Heilongjiang faction, made up of 9 men from various northeastern provinces and led by Liu Guiduo. The 2 men closest to him in the group were Jiang Xiaolong, who grew up in the same county, and the youngest crew member Huang Jinbo. The third close-knit group were the 6 men from Inner Mongolia, whose leader was a man named Baode Geji Rihu, the other crew members calling him Baode. Only 3 men didn't align with any particular faction: Duan Zhifang, Cui Yong, and Ma Yuchao. When in their different factions, each group would default to speaking in their local dialects of Chinese, meaning much of what was being said between members couldn't be understood by the others. Despite the crew dividing themselves into groups, the only issue that emerged early into the journey was the less experienced seafarers struggling with seasickness as they took time to find their sea legs. The boat reached the fishing waters off the coast of Peru in late February 2011, 6 weeks after setting sail, and the crew got to work. With squid being more active and closer to the surface of the water at night, the crew began fishing once it went dark, and worked through the night until the following morning. Multicolored hooks were dropped into the sea and jigged around to mimic movements of prey, while powerful lights were shined on the water to attract more squid. Liu Guiduo proved himself one of the better workers. During a single month he pulled in 13,000 pounds of squid himself. He also advised some of the younger crew members on how to catch more, as they struggled to keep up with the more experienced men. The work was long and arduous, and cracks in morale began to emerge. With the long hours on deck, often in harsh weather, some of the crew began shirking the work, which potentially affected everyone's earnings, and the management of Captain Li Chengquan saw tempers getting frayed. The majority of other fishing vessels in the area would stop work at around 9 in the morning, but Li Chengquan kept the men working till midday, even if there was little coming onto the boat. The first major flashpoint occurred between new chef Xia Qiyong, who despite being from Heilongjiang had aligned with the Liaoning faction, and crew member Jiang Xiaolong, part of the Heilongjiang group. The 2 men had been drinking heavily during some rare downtime, before getting into an argument. The chef Xia Qiyong wasn't especially popular with much of the crew. He was viewed as a sycophant towards the captain, who liked to boast about himself. He and Jiang Xiaolong actually came from the same hometown, which played a part in the disagreement, and as the argument got more heated, Jiang Xiaolong threatened the chef with a knife. Other members of the crew pulled the two men apart, and Captain Li Chengquan punished the Heilongjiang man with a beating, while Xia Qiyong only received a warning. As time went on, Li Chengquan pushed the crew to work harder, leading to them often working 20-hour days, which saw discontent rising. When being interviewed years later, Duan Zhifang said that as anger spread around the ship, he noticed Liu Guiduo frequently pulling individual crew members aside and having private conversations, as if he was planning something. Liu Guiduo had grown increasingly unhappy with the management of the crew, and had been spending the little free time available poring over the contract all deckhands had signed. While it stated that each man catching squid would be paid 95,000 yuan, 11,400 USD, plus 400 yuan, a little under $50 per ton, Liu Guiduo believed he found an issue. The payment stated on the contract would only be paid out if the crew reached a certain level of tonnage in squid, and failure to meet the requirements saw the salary drop dramatically. After doing the math, Liu Guiduo found that if they failed to meet the required quota, the crew would only be paid the equivalent of 25 cents per kilo, and that the salary only amounted to 1,000 yuan, $120 per month. This was also before various deductions for food, accommodation, and payment for other sundries provided by the company were applied, meaning that it was possible some of the crew could finish the trip actually owing the company money. Each of the men on board, barring the senior crew members who were getting paid much more, essentially signed what's referred to in China as a yiyang hetung. This means there are two parts to the contract, one clearly shown, and another hidden with ambiguous language and legalese. Given that most of the crew were uneducated or had little experience signing labor contracts at all, combined with the large salaries supposedly on offer, none of them bothered to check the very small print. A furious Liu Guiduo confronted Li Chengquan to see if he was right about his discovery. The captain confirmed he was indeed correct in his reading of the contract, and admitted the crew were only being paid 1,000 yuan per month if they failed to meet the hidden and virtually impossible contractual requirements. Liu Guiduo demanded the captain turn the ship around and head back to China, saying he was going to sue the company over the illegal contract. However, Li Chengquan refused, and reminded Liu Guiduo that he was among the illegal workers without a seafarer's license, so he'd have no legal recourse to sue the company. The senior crew were all being paid significantly more, getting 150,000 yuan, around $18,000 plus commission, and would only fail to receive payment if they didn't complete the trip. The captain also warned Liu Guiduo that if he attempted to get on another boat in the area which was returning to China, the other vessels would refuse because he didn't have the necessary paperwork, and so the other boat's crew would be guilty of people trafficking. An angered Liu Guiduo shared the information with the other men in the Heilongjiang faction, and the anger quickly spread among the group. They agreed they should head home, so started to formulate the idea of taking over the ship and forcing Li Chengquan to head back to China, but the Liaoning faction outnumbered them. While they plotted, they continued to work, and the crew became increasingly frustrated with Li Chengquan. He beat those he felt weren't pulling their weight, and when men got injured, a frequent occurrence given how hard they were being pushed, the injured men weren't given time off. Instead, they received threats of salary deductions for missing work. The Heilongjiang faction distanced themselves from the Liaoning group, and started talking more to the tightest knit group, the Inner Mongolians. Thus far, the Inner Mongolian faction had largely isolated itself from the others. While the men from the northeastern provinces would speak in their local dialects, there were some aspects of language that both groups could understand. The Inner Mongolian dialect, however, was completely incomprehensible to the northeasterners. Furthermore, some of the Inner Mongolians could only speak and understand very limited Mandarin, so often avoided trying to talk to the other men. However, they had noticed the storm brewing between the other main groups, and spoke about it openly among each other, believing the other men couldn't understand them. Unbeknownst to them, Liu Guiduo had an ace up his sleeve. 20-year-old Huang Jinbo was originally from the Inner Mongolian city Yakushi, but lived in Heilongjiang for much of his life. Despite his roots, he was Han Chinese ethnicity rather than Mongolian, so this combined with him living in Heilongjiang saw him align with Liu Guiduo. His background meant he was familiar with Inner Mongolian dialects, so he could listen in on conversations and act as a go-between, feeling out if the Inner Mongolian group would join the men from Heilongjiang, thus evening out the numbers. The final group of Duan Zhifang, Cui Yong and Ma Yuchao still hadn't aligned with any of the main groups. As such, they weren't a part of the political maneuverings going on between the factions, but still had the sense something was wrong. In early June 2011, leader of the Inner Mongolians Bao De began speaking with Liu Guiduo. He told the head of the Heilongjiang group that his men were getting tired of the treatment they were receiving from the senior crew and felt the workload was too much. Liu Guiduo informed Bao De about the unfair contracts they'd signed, the truth about the payment, and his plan to take over the ship and return to China. In response, Bao De said his men would join him in the proposed mutiny, taking the mutineers' numbers up to 15. On June 17, 2011, the ship had just finished refueling at a seaport 200 nautical miles off the coast of Chile. At around 11 p.m., Duan Zhifang was working trying to catch squid when Liu Guiduo came over to speak with him. Liu Guiduo asked the younger man if he could borrow the knife at his workstation, then told Duan Zhifang he and some of the other men were going to hijack the ship. Liu Guiduo went on to say anyone that tried to stop them would be put on life rafts, with the mutineers contacting other boats in the area to pick those men up. Liu Guiduo asked Duan Zhifang if he wanted to join them, to which the younger man replied saying, while he wouldn't try to stop them, he didn't feel he was up to participating. Liu Guiduo understood the decision and walked away. Duan Zhifang kept on working, but found it hard to concentrate, knowing what was about to take place. He thought about going up to the bridge to warn the captain about the impending mutiny, but when looking around at his crewmates he couldn't be sure who was a hijacker and who wasn't. Liu Guiduo, Huang Jinbo, Jiang Xiaolong, Liu Chenglian, and Wang Peng, all members of the Heilongjiang faction, were joined by Bao De, Shuangxi, and Dai Fushun from the Inner Mongolian group as the mutiny got underway. Arming themselves with knives and iron bars, the men made their way up to the bridge. On the orders of Liu Guiduo, Huang Jinbo and Wang Peng went to destroy the ship's communications and GPS tracking systems. Jiang Xiaolong and Liu Chenglian were told to guard the stairwell leading to the upper deck, making sure they stopped the Liaoning men from trying to interrupt the hijacking. Liu Guiduo, with Bao De and the other two Inner Mongolians, Shuangxi and Dai Fushun, went to the captain's cabin to confront Li Chengquan. They told him they were taking over the ship, demanded he turn around and head back to China, and began beating him to make sure the captain knew they were serious. The shouting and other noises coming from the captain's cabin attracted the attention of the crew members on deck, and someone gave the order to pull in the jigs and to weigh anchor. News got to ship cook Xia Qiyong that the captain was being attacked, and he came running to the bridge, armed with a knife. He was stopped at the top of the stairs by the person he'd previously had an altercation with, Jiang Xiaolong, who was guarding the stairs with Liu Chenglian. A struggle ensued, the cook receiving hard blows to the legs with an iron bar from Liu Chenglian, causing Xia Qiyong to fall to the floor, before Jiang Xiaolong attacked him with a knife. The chef received wounds to the back, chest, and neck, and quickly bled out from the injuries sustained. First Officer Fu Yizhong then came up to find out what was happening, but on seeing the body of Xia Qiyong, he submitted to the mutineers without struggle. Wanting to avoid any more violence, Li Chengquan agreed to the hijackers' demands and used the ship's satellite navigation phones to set a course back to China. Duan Zhifang had heard the noise from the bridge, but with the bright lights they used to attract squid shining, he'd been unable to get a clear view of what happened. The first man to come down to the deck was Huang Jinbo, who approached Duan Zhifang asking for a cigarette, before telling him they'd taken over the ship, and the cook was dead. Jiang Xiaolong then called the young man up to the bridge to inform him that he'd be on cooking duty in the morning, so told him to go get some sleep. Noticing the blood swishing around his feet, Duan Zhifang accepted the order and went back to his cabin. Members of both the Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolian factions who didn't take part in the mutiny had been on deck, armed and awaiting instructions. Once they were given the word by Liu Guiduo, they began rounding up the members of the Liaoning faction and collected all knives, hooks, and other items that could be used as weapons. Captain Li Chengquan, along with Fu Yizhong and second officer Wang Yongbo, were tied up and kept under guard in the captain's cabin, and all potential weapons apart from those being carried by the mutineers were locked away. The body of Xia Qiyong was thrown overboard into the ocean, never to be found. Liu Guiduo explained to the Liaoning and unaligned men the reason behind the mutiny, adding that they were heading back to China. He went on to say he didn't want any more violence, and any crew member wanting to join them was welcome to do so. He promised that anyone that wouldn't be harmed, as long as they didn't try to interrupt their plan. The crew went back down to their cabins, but little was said about the events that just took place. The only topic of conversation was an agreement that to explain the chef's absence once they returned to China was to say he fell overboard. They intended to return home, passing Hawaii, which would take an estimated 50 days. Member of the Heilongjiang faction Wang Peng had prior sailing experience, so he was charged with piloting the ship, while the captain and other senior officers remained locked up. Back in China, the company chartering the ship realized the vessel had disappeared from their tracking system, and that they had lost contact with the crew. Over the following days they continued to try communicating with the ship. When there was no reply, a search mission was organized, but it failed to find the missing vessel. In the days following the mutiny, a few of the Liaoning faction decided to align with the mutineers, thinking it would be the safer choice, given what happened to cook Xia Qiyong. Other members of the Liaoning faction refused, either because they were loyal to the captain or related to the senior crew members. Knowing the mutineers were armed, the Liaoning faction members were constantly paranoid they might meet the same fate as Xia Qiyong. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere seemed to relax, and with no work to do the crew spent much of their free time drinking and gambling. However, an air of suspicion remained, with Liu Guiduo worried that men loyal to the captain may attempt to take the ship back. He used Huang Jinbo as his spy, tasking him with listening to conversations between the Inner Mongolians, and watching other members of the crew, noting who was talking to who. The leader of the mutineers was also becoming increasingly concerned about what the Liaoning men were going to say after returning to China. As boredom spread, so did a rumor that there was going to be a rebellion against Liu Guiduo and the other mutineers. In private meetings between Liu Guiduo, Bao De, and the other people who directly participated in the mutiny, they discussed putting the Liaoning men into lifeboats, leaving them to fend for themselves. In mid-July, in the waters to the west of Hawaii, an issue emerged. With only 2 people capable of maintaining the ship's engines, chief engineer and member of the Liaoning faction Wen Dou was ordered to continue working, but always under the watchful eyes of Bo Fujun of the Heilongjiang gang. In their haste to get back to China, they had been running the engines too hard, which saw the auxiliary engines starting to fail, and they were burning through fuel at a much faster rate than expected. A furious Liu Guiduo believed Wen Dou was trying to sabotage their plan. Bo Fujun also claimed the chief engineer was the person organizing the rebellion, and asked him to betray the mutineers by switching sides. In the evening of July 20, 2011, Wen Dou was approached by Huang Jinbo, who told the chief engineer the ship's rudder appeared to have an issue. He followed Huang Jinbo and was surprised by several of the mutineers, Jiang Xiaolong taking the lead, attacking him with knives and ending his life, before throwing the body into the sea. At the same time, Duan Zhifang, sleeping in one of the cabins below deck, was woken when Liu Chenglian entered and told anyone who was awake to come up on deck. Realizing something bad was about to happen, Duan Zhifang pretended to be asleep as men followed Liu Chenglian, and loud music started being played on the main deck. While this was happening, members of the Inner Mongolian faction Shuangxi and Dai Fushun tracked down Wen Mi, the cousin of Wen Dou, and ended his life with their knives, the body also being thrown overboard. 2 men belonging to the Liaoning faction, Liu Gang and Yue Peng, followed Liu Chenglian, and were attacked by Bao De and the man who'd woken them, their lives being ended at the end of the men's knives. The mutineers then headed to the cabin where second officer Wang Yongbo was sleeping. Wang Yongbo was originally held captive along with the captain, but needing an experienced seafarer to assist Wang Peng with piloting the ship, he'd been released. Wang Yongbo was attacked while lying in bed, Bao De and Liu Chengnian the first to strike. Wang Yongbo tried to fight back, but more men plunged their knives into his abdomen. Severely injured, Wang Yongbo rolled off the bunk onto the floor, where Liu Guiduo finished him off. Shuangxi and Dai Fushun tracked down one more member of the Liaoning group, Jiang Shutao, and ended his life before throwing his body overboard with the rest of the evening's victims. In a single night, 6 of the crew had their lives ended, all members of the Liaoning faction. As the mutineers cleaned themselves up after the night's events, Liu Guiduo noticed Duan Zhifang was awake, and reminded him that he'd refused the offer to join them, and asked if he was afraid. Before Duan Zhifang answered, Liu Guiduo told him not to worry. He considered him a brother and wouldn't touch him. As dawn broke the following morning, the purge continued on deck. 2 distant relatives of Chief Engineer Wen Dou became the next targets. Chen Guojun was forced to jump into the ocean at knife point by Liu Guiduo, and Wu Guozhi was attacked by several of the armed mutineers and thrown overboard. By noon, another man would be pulled on deck to face the mutineers. However, this time the target was a member of the Heilongjiang group, Bo Fujun. Liu Guiduo still believed Wen Dou had attempted to sabotage the boat's engines, and felt Bo Fujun, who was tasked with watching him, should have noticed and stopped him. Unable to trust him anymore, Liu Guiduo told some of the men who'd yet to bloody their knives to end the man's life, then throw the body overboard. That took the death toll for the past 24 hours up to 9, and left the Heilongjiang faction as the strongest. With them being safely locked up, and Liu Guiduo believing they may be needed if the boat ran into trouble, Captain Li Chengquan and First Officer Fu Yizhong escaped the purge and were allowed to live. The remaining Liaoning men had already aligned with the mutineers, so the violence stopped, Liu Guiduo believing he'd quelled any possible rebellion. Terrified by what had taken place, Duan Zhifang began searching the boat for somewhere he could hide if more violence broke out and he became a target. While up on deck, Jiang Xiaolong spotted what he was doing. He approached Duan Zhifang and told him no one was looking to harm him. Trying to act calm, Duan Zhifang joked back, saying if they were going to come for him, just tell him in advance, and he'd jump overboard to save them the trouble. He began looking at the lifeboats, thinking about escaping, but they'd all been locked up, and any flotation devices had been locked away by the mutineers. The stress and fear became too much for the university graduate Ma Yuchao, and he eventually made the decision to take his chances in the sea, and threw himself overboard. It took a while before anyone realized Ma Yuchao was missing. It was only after Duan Zhifang found a note left on the college graduate's bed, which ended with him saying, "I'm scared, and just want to get home safely," that the crew realized he was gone. When Liu Guiduo was told about Ma Yuchao jumping off the ship, he reacted with surprise and disappointment. He claimed he had no issue with the young man, and had no plans to hurt him, shocking the other men by claiming that Ma Yuchao secretly worked for him, spying on the Liaoning faction prior to the mutiny. The claim about Ma Yuchao confused the other mutineers, who never saw anything that suggested Liu Guiduo and Ma Yuchao even spoke all that often. No one was sure if it was true or not, but the mere possibility reignited the sense of paranoia among the remaining crew. There was now less trust between the mutineers, which made them much more wary about who they spoke to and what they said. It seemed the paranoia was also getting to Liu Guiduo. He moved out of the crew cabin and into the captain's quarters, having 2 men on guard outside the door at all times. Before taking the job on the fishing vessel, Duan Zhifang worked as a cook for a hotel. His past experience is what led to him being told to take over cooking duties after the death of Xia Qiyong. Previously, he'd been left to work alone. However, now while he was performing his duties, Duan Zhifang was watched over constantly, to make sure he wasn't putting anything in the food that shouldn't be there. With them being the only 2 men left on the ship who didn't have an affiliation with a particular group, Cui Yong approached Duan Zhifang and suggested they should pledge their loyalty to Liu Guiduo. They first spoke with Jiang Xiaolong, telling him they wanted to talk with Liu Guiduo, and the reason why. Jiang Xiaolong suggested they should stay out of it, telling them their hands were still clean for now, but if they joined the mutineers, there'd be no going back. Cui Yong said he still wanted to join, so Jiang Xiaolong allowed them to go see Liu Guiduo. The two men went to the cabin Liu Guiduo was using. Cui Yong told him if there was anything else planned, to count he and Duan Zhifang in. By this point, Liu Guiduo had changed the boat's plans. Instead of heading back to China, they were going to sneak into Japan where he claimed he had contacts who could help them get fake identity documents. Liu Guiduo suggested to Cui Yong and Duan Zhifang it was better for them to try and head back to China, as they hadn't taken part in the violence, but Cui Yong maintained he wanted to join the mutineers, while Duan Zhifang remained silent. While the plan to head to Japan had seemingly been accepted by the crew, behind the scenes, some weren't happy with the decision. The Inner Mongolian faction in particular disliked the idea, and when Huang Jinbo wasn't around they discussed it among themselves, and possible solutions. Further dissatisfaction began to spread among the Heilongjiang faction, who to this point had been completely loyal to Liu Guiduo, when he ordered all crew members to use the satellite phone and contact their families to ask them to transfer 5,000 yuan, a little over $600 to his personal bank account. Liu Guiduo claimed the money was to pay for the identity documents once they got to Japan. However, many of the men came from families who either didn't have or couldn't afford to just hand over the money. Only two men were actually able to successfully get the money, members of the Inner Mongolian faction, Shan Guoxi and Qiu Ronghua. Friction then began to develop between Liu Guiduo and Bao De, the leader of the Inner Mongolians, believing Liu Guiduo was going to get rid of as many of them as he could, and keep any money he got for himself. Sensing several of the Heilongjiang men also felt unhappy with Liu Guiduo, Bao De approached the man originally from Inner Mongolia, Huang Jinbo. Bao De told Huang Jinbo that Liu Guiduo was only going to take a few of the mutineers to Japan, and planned to end the lives of the rest. Huang Jinbo had been noticeably annoyed with Liu Guiduo for demanding the money, and agreed to switch his allegiance to the Inner Mongolians. However, after agreeing to side with Bao De, he immediately went to inform Liu Guiduo about the plot brewing against him. Huang Jinbo told Liu Guiduo there was something he needed to know, to which Liu Guiduo preemptively asked if Bao De wanted him dead, already having sensed the Inner Mongolians planned to turn on him. Unsure how many men were ready to betray him, the lead mutineer wanted to add more numbers to his gang. He first approached Cui Yong and Duan Zhifang, telling them if they still wanted to join him they'd soon have the chance to prove themselves. He then went to see the ship's captain Li Chengquan. Li Chengquan hadn't been allowed out of his prison since the mutiny began, leaving him completely unaware of the violence that had taken place, and that most of the senior crew were dead. Liu Guiduo believed getting the captain to join him would make the remaining Liaoning men, who were still loyal to Li Chengquan, less of a potential threat. When telling the captain about the violence, he blamed Bao De and the Inner Mongolians for the deaths, saying he and the other Heilongjiang men weren't involved. Liu Guiduo went on to explain the plan to head to Japan, saying he felt it was safer than returning to China, because the Chinese police may blame all crew members for what had taken place on the ship. Li Chengquan believed that with him being the ship's captain, it was likely he'd be held partially responsible for the deaths, so agreed with the idea to head to Japan where he had some relatives. A plan was put together to deal with Bao De. The first action was to disarm the Inner Mongolian men. Shuangxi and Dai Fushun were keeping guard over the cabin holding Fu Yizhong and were approached by two of the Heilongjiang faction, who told the Inner Mongolians to take a break, but said they needed to use their knives. The Inner Mongolians handed over their weapons, and left their post unarmed without suspecting anything was unusual. To prove his commitment and loyalty, Cui Yong was told he was going to be bait for the attack on Bao De, to which he agreed. Liu Guiduo met with Bao De and told the leader of the Inner Mongolians that the captain was going to join them. However, he wanted to make sure they could fully trust him, so they needed to get Li Chengquan to end someone's life to prove he was with them. Bao De agreed, and Liu Guiduo told him he'd chosen the unaffiliated Cui Yong as the sacrificial lamb, and asked Bao De to bring him up on deck. Before he went to get Cui Yong, Liu Guiduo asked Bao De for his knife, so the unarmed captain could use it. The unsuspecting Bao handed over the weapon, then went to the crew cabins. When he returned on deck with Cui Yong walking behind him, several members of the Heilongjiang men confronted Bao along with Captain Li Chengquan holding his weapon. Unbeknownst to Bao, Cui Yong was also armed, Liu Guiduo already having handed him the weapon. Bao was attacked by Li Chengquan to the front, and Cui Yong from behind. He shouted for help in his Inner Mongolian dialect, but his men weren't around to hear his pleas. In desperation, Bao pushed past his attackers and jumped into the sea. As he drifted away from the boat, Liu Guiduo taunted the Inner Mongolian, making sure he knew Huang Jinbo betrayed him. The Heilongjiang mutineers then hunted down the remaining Inner Mongolians. The now unarmed and defenseless Shuangxi and Dai Fushun, who'd both actively participated in the previous violence, were the next targets. Shuangxi, seeing what was coming, chose to jump off the ship. Dai Fushun was dragged up onto the main deck where his life was ended, and he joined Bao and Shuangxi in the water. The final 3 men, Bao Baocheng, Shan Guoxi and Qiu Ronghua, were forced to jump ship and left to die in the water. Of the original 33-man crew, just 16 remained, with the ship only an estimated 10 days from Japan. However, more trouble was on the horizon. In the early hours of the morning following the purge of the Inner Mongolian faction, Captain Li Chengquan went to the toilet, but as he walked, his experience told him something was wrong with the vessel. The ship felt sluggish and was moving far slower than it should have been. He went down to the engine room to investigate, and found they were taking on water. Someone had opened a safety valve, allowing seawater to flood the lower decks. Li Chengquan raised the alarm, informing the other men that they were sinking, still miles away from land. Since the body of Chief Engineer Wen Dou had been thrown overboard, Second Engineer Wang Yanlong was the person placed in charge of maintaining the engines. However, the second engineer was now nowhere to be seen. Liu Guiduo ordered some of the men to search every inch of the ship for the missing Wang Yanlong, while others began trying to pump out the water. The search of the vessel turned up nothing. It appeared that the second engineer was no longer on board. While they continued to pump out the water, some men began looking for a way to close the safety valve. Others were told to begin jettisoning items to lighten the vessel. The cargo of squid they'd previously caught had long ago been emptied back into the sea, so now they were throwing whatever they could do without overboard. With such a massive emergency, it was all hands on deck, and First Officer Fu Yizhong was released from his cabin prison to assist. Once let out, he was shocked at how few of the men were left, and had little desire to help the mutineers or remain on the ship. In the chaos taking place, the first officer found the last remaining members of the Liaoning faction, Ding Yumin, Song Guochun and Gong Xuejun, who'd aligned with the mutineers, and the quartet began hastily putting together a makeshift raft. With the crew throwing items overboard, the room flotation devices had been locked away was open. The remaining Liaoning men each grabbed a life jacket, dropped the raft into the sea, making sure it was first tethered to the vessel, and lowered themselves onto it. As the men were getting on the raft, they were spotted by the crew on the deck. Liu Guiduo ordered them to get back on board the ship, but Fu Yizhong shouted back if they did they'd end up dead, and cut the line tethering them to the ship. The raft began drifting away from the boat, with the men paddling hard to help put some distance between them and the stricken vessel. Eventually the crew managed to slow the sinking of the boat, but they still couldn't pilot the ship. Feeling they had little other option, Liu Guiduo and Li Chengquan agreed that they needed to send out an SOS and wait for rescue. In order to stabilize their position while they tried to deal with the ship taking on water, the crew had dropped a sea anchor. The anchor eventually helped the stricken ship into a current, which saw the vessel drift towards the raft of the 4 Liaoning men. On seeing they were now gaining on the raft, Liu Guiduo told the crew to grab some large fishing hooks and heavy iron sinkers. Once alongside the raft, they began pelting the escapees with the items, causing injuries to the Liaoning men and forcing 3 of them to abandon the raft. The last man clinging on was Ding Yumin. Duan Zhifang claimed Jiang Xiaolong jumped down to the raft holding a harpoon and ended the man's life. As Fu Yizhong and Gong Xuejun drifted away to their inevitable deaths, Song Guochun was holding onto the anchor line, begging the other men to pull him back onto the boat. After a few minutes of silence, Liu Guiduo ordered the others to fish him out of the water. As Song Guochun was surrounded by the men on deck, there was now the question of what to do with him. It initially appeared Liu Guiduo intended to let the man live, but Li Chengquan pointed out that both Duan Zhifang and Xiang Lishan, a member of the Heilongjiang faction, were the only two men left on board whose hands were still clean. The captain was concerned that if the men didn't have victims to their names, there was nothing to stop them telling the authorities what had really taken place on the boat, and so they needed to show they could be trusted. Hearing the captain's words and realizing his life was on the line, Xiang Lishan grabbed a knife ready to take the life of Song Guojun, hoping to protect his own, but Liu Guiduo stopped him. Instead, Duan Zhifang and Xiang Lishan were told to remove the life jacket Song Guochun wore, bind the man's hands, attach sinking weights to him, and toss him back overboard. As he was being bound, Song Guochun begged for his life, appealing to Liu Guiduo, promising he wouldn't give them up to the police when they got back to China. His tearful pleas fell on deaf ears, and the men who bound him pushed him overboard into the sea. Song Guochun struggled to stay afloat, but eventually sank out of sight. With nothing left to do but wait for the distress call to be answered, the surviving crew sat around and started putting together their story. Hoping to play into discriminatory attitudes towards ethnic minorities, they decided to blame the Inner Mongolian faction for the violence that took place, and claimed that they were the ones who left the boat on the makeshift raft. On July 25, 2011, the ship was spotted by a Japanese Coast Guard plane, set out to find the vessel. On confirming the identity of the ship, a boat was dispatched to tow it back towards Chinese waters. The ship was then handed over to the Chinese Fisheries Administration, and the crew were heading back to China. Now able to contact the vessel, head of the region's Fisheries Administration asked Captain Li Chengquan if all members of the crew were well, only to be informed just 11 men were returning. After a moment of stunned silence, the head of the Fisheries Administration asked what happened, to which Li Chengquan replied saying the situation was complicated, and would explain everything once they returned to port. As the crew were being towed back, there remained a sense of paranoia on board. It seemed everyone walked round with a concealed weapon for self-defense, and people were separating into smaller groups, having secret conversations away from the others. Wang Peng and Huang Jinbo were spotted scribbling notes onto pieces of scrap paper. They'd then fold the notes into paper planes and throw them out to sea. One note was found by Liu Guiduo, who reacted angrily when he read the contents, but now they were being taken back to China, with the Coast Guard watching the crew. There was little he could do. As the ship was being towed, some of the survivors went through the belongings of the deceased crew, and found that one man kept a record of the events in their diary, and had noted the names of the people responsible for the death of cook Sa Qiyong. The discovery of the diary caused the crew to search for any other records of what took place, and any notes found that told the truth about what happened on board were quickly destroyed. On August 12, 2011, the crew arrived back in Shidao Harbor, and were welcomed home by numerous armed police officers who took the returning men into custody to answer some questions. The men who walked off the vessel were ship's captain and last surviving member of the Liaoning faction, Li Chengquan, the man who initiated the violent mutiny, Liu Guiduo, and his three most loyal lieutenants, Jiang Xiaolong, Huang Jinbo, and Liu Chengnian. The other surviving members of the Heilongjiang faction were Wang Peng, who piloted the ship after the mutiny, Xiang Lishan, who pushed Song Guochun into the ocean, and Mei Linsheng and Feng Xingyan, who both took active roles in the purges of the other factions. The final two men were Cui Yong and Duan Zhifang, who, while being unaffiliated, eventually participated in the deaths of other crew members. The mutineers stuck to the story about the Inner Mongolian men being responsible for the deaths of the missing crew members. However, the officers interrogating them weren't buying it. They found it somewhat unbelievable that just 6 men could take over the ship and end the lives of 22 crew members. Eventually, one of the mutineers confessed the truth, hoping his coming clean would see him handed a lenient sentence. That man was the person who'd perhaps been the most loyal member of the Heilongjiang faction, Huang Jinbo. Once Huang Jinbo told the truth, the other men followed suit and confessed to their various roles and actions in the mutiny, hoping to save themselves. The only man who refused to change his story was Liu Guiduo, maintaining that Balde and the Inner Mongolians were responsible. After a 15-month investigation into the events that took place on the ship, the 11 surviving crew members went on trial. Liu Guiduo continued to protest innocence despite the testimony from the other men on trial with him. All men were found guilty of the charges they faced, and on March 19, 2013 the verdicts were handed down. Liu Guiduo, Jiang Xiaolong, Huang Jinbo and Liu Chenglian were found guilty of hijacking and sentenced to life in prison, and were also guilty of multiple counts of intentional homicide, for which they were sentenced to death. The ship's captain Li Chengquan was found guilty of intentional homicide and also received the death penalty. Wang Peng was found guilty of hijacking and sentenced to 12 years in prison. He was also found guilty of intentional homicide and was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve. Defendant Feng Xingyan was found guilty of intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison. Both Cui Yong and Mei Linsheng were found guilty of intentional homicide. However, the courts decided their actions were performed in fear for their own lives. Consequently, they were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Xiang Lishan and Duan Zhifang were both sentenced to 4 years in prison. Again, the courts took into account the extreme circumstances surrounding the death of Song Guojun when coming to their final decision. The men condemned to death had an extended wait in prison, as an investigation was carried out on the company that sent the men out to sea, Xinfa Aquatic Products. The authorities were looking at the contracts the men signed, and the fact that 18 men on board didn't have seafaring licenses. Along with the 10 men who didn't have any license at all, there were a further 8 with forged paperwork. As the investigation into the company was ongoing, Liu Guiduo waited on death row, and seemingly hadn't learned his lesson. He reportedly hatched a plan to escape, and attempted to convince his cellmates to join him. This saw him eventually being isolated in his own cell. The death sentences handed to Liu Guiduo, Li Chengquan, Jiang Xiaolong, Liu Chenglian, and Huang Jinbo were eventually reviewed by the Supreme Court. On March 23, 2017, it was announced that the Supreme Court would uphold the death penalties given to the 5 men. As of the making of this video, there has been no official confirmation that the punishments have been carried out. However, after a Supreme Court ruling, it usually takes place shortly after the judgment is announced. The investigation into Xinfa Aquatic Products Company found that the organization couldn't be held criminally responsible for the mutiny. The company owned the boat and were responsible for the contracts of the senior crew members. The illegal contracts signed by the workers were done third-party through an agency. However, the families of several of the deceased crew initiated a civil lawsuit in attempts to sue the company. Despite having no requirement to do so, and most likely looking for some good PR to restore their image, in response the company came to an out-of-court settlement with the families. In 2016, an article penned by journalist Du Qiang gave a first-hand account of the events that took place on the vessel, after he interviewed one of the surviving mutineers. The interviewee was the first to be released from prison, and gave his account under a pseudonym. However, it didn't take much investigation work for readers to figure out the person was most likely Duan Zhifang. The timing fit with the sentence given to Duan Zhifang, but perhaps the biggest giveaway was the name Duan Zhifang never being mentioned in the series of interviews. The story quickly amassed 30 million views on the Chinese social media site Weibo, and an English translation of the work would be published in the online magazine, Words Without Borders. The interest the story generated saw people adapting it into different forms of media. The visual novel game One Way Ticket, produced by Zodiac Interactive in 2018, was loosely based on the mutiny, albeit with the characters being changed to Japanese. In 2017, a big-screen adaptation of the story was produced, however it failed to be released, partly down to the incident still being an active police investigation, and partly because of the violence portrayed in the movie. After 6 years and several name changes, it was announced the film was going to be released on streaming platforms under the name Haishi, meaning Devouring Sea, but was finally changed to Yuanhang, meaning Distant Journey. However, Shortly after its release on May 27, 2023, it was suddenly removed from sites, the notoriously squeamish Chinese censorship board feeling it was too violent. Unfortunately for anyone interested in watching the movie, it's remarkably difficult to find. The only sign it exists somewhere are trailers for the movie on this website, under the English name Doomed at Sea. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a comment, giving it a like, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.